It was interesting when I asked one of the public health people, in what form is the yellow cake brought into Toronto, and she said, I think it's in sacks.
You're listening to TMI for the week of April 9th, 2018.
Today on the show, Dr. James Deutsch, bringing to light some of his efforts battling a uranium pellet plant that looms near his home in the center of Canada's largest city, Toronto. We asked him about his appearance at the hearings and meetings held regarding the uranium pellet plant at Lansdowne and Dupont.
This was for the CNSC hearing, actually. So prior to my medical training, I worked with various radioisotopes, also known as radionuclides, as part of my PhD and postdoctoral research in biochemistry. In the various laboratories in which I worked, I experienced firsthand how even the most educated and trained individuals can make careless mistakes. I live a 7-minute bike ride downwind from the GE Hitachi plant, and have a child living within several blocks of the plant. I am extremely concerned, the more I look into it, of disasters waiting to happen at or around the plant.
Well,
is that good enough?
Yeah, that little blurb there is what I'm here for.
Okay.
So that's terrific.
I hadn't looked at this in about 3 years, and I just dug it out of my files this morning. So,
when were these hearings?
In December 10 and 11, 2013.
So 2 years after the Fukushima accident.
Mm-hmm.
And how much public interest was there about the plant? Has it died down since Fukushima?
I'm not the best person to say, but I see nothing about it at all. And when I mention it here and there to people, they're really surprised and astonished that there's an actual plant there, and that such a thing could exist. Now, it used to be an industrial area, but it's become a residential area. So the situation's changed.
There was some residential in that area, but largely because there were CP rail tracks, and that whole Dupont Street corridor was largely industry. Ice factories and old factories. In fact, most of the remaining buildings along Dupont are World War II or before factories.
That's right, and I understand this plant it dates from the 50s, if not earlier. So it got in really early in terms of the so-called nuclear renaissance.
So one of the issues at Pickering is that when Pickering was built, the population was not anywhere near what it is now. And even if you argued that siting it close to Toronto at the time could have been an evidence of hubris, the population has skyrocketed around Pickering, and now Pickering really is in the middle of the town, the city of Pickering, and you would never site such a plant in such a location now.
Hopefully not. I think more recently they tend to go for rural areas. For example, in the U.S. South, they would go for counties that had higher levels of poverty and more racialized, or in that case, black populations.
So, in Toronto now, and in the last 5 years, there is condo after condo after condo in every corner of the city. We've never seen such building before. And the last time we saw a bunch of condos be built in the early 80s, those developers went bankrupt. Cadillac Fairview.
That's right, yeah.
So,
yeah,
but all of a sudden now,
that.
You can build everywhere in the city. A crane is in every direction. If there's 360 degrees, there are 360 cranes, it seems, everywhere in Toronto. I can't understand that. But near this plant at Dupont and Lansdowne, the same kind of urban development is happening. It's townhouses, blocks and blocks of new residential have cropped up around this plant.
That's right, and I think just up the hill by St. Clair, you have the old stockyards. Just to the west, you have the junction. There's a lot going on around there.
And nothing's changed about the plant. It's still a uranium pellet factory.
That's right. They bring the yellow cake down on trucks from up north, and they put it into ceramic pellets at high temperature. And incidentally, at the time that there was a lot of activism and community concern as a result of that, back in 2013, there was a concern about the railway tracks that were within several meters at most of that plant. And it was along those railroad tracks that the Lac Mégantic oil train traveled on its way to its fateful end.
Okay. All right. I'll throw this in. I'll up you one. The Mississauga train derailment of 1989. And, pictures of that are just fireballs. Now maybe my Google mapping isn't what it should be, but I thought those CPR rails went right through that property, not feet away from. I thought that those rails go right through the GE property.
Probably through the property. It's I'm just thinking of the building itself. Like if you look at the outer wall, it's not very far from those tracks.
So in 2013, how did interest get organized? Was it Zach Ruiter?
Yeah, I believe it was mainly him. He did a tremendous amount of work, and he'd gotten his start, as far as I recall, from the time that he was in Peterborough, where they have the plant that packages these ceramic uranium pellets into the zirconium rods that then get taken to the various reactors. When he moved to Toronto, he became aware, or perhaps he was already aware, of the plant. And the point was that he made at the time that just over 50% of the uranium in use in reactors in Canada traveled through that plant.
Toronto, as part of the GTA, is 5.5 million people. So right through some pretty expensive real estate. I mean, I always kind of chuckle, Forest Hill, they're all oblivious to this. And they're probably all investing in Comico and all the companies that do this. And they're feet away from this plant. Very expensive real estate. You figure by now they would relocate the plant, or it would cause some kind of real estate stigma or something.
Well, I mean, what you're touching on is so crucial to any kind of conversation about this, that one can be in proximity to a major disaster and not look at it. I know that after that explosion in Lac Mégantic, I pursued some information, and I ended up being in contact with someone in the Ministry of the Environment of Ontario. She was a PhD student who happened to have a short-term contract job there, and she responded to my email. I was asking about what the emergency plan was should there be an explosion of an oil train along those tracks that travel through Toronto, and essentially there was none. So the bigger the disaster, in some ways it appears that the less there are coherent plans that take into account the reality that disaster would be. Just to touch on another aspect of this whole area, at one of the meetings, I went up to one of the doctors with Toronto Public Health, And I pointed out that this was just not long after Fukushima, and I said that this is a public health emergency for Toronto, along with many other cities. What are you doing about it? Why aren't you screaming about that something has to happen, that, you need an international effort way beyond what Japan is capable of to do something to mitigate this ongoing disaster? He seemed kind of puzzled by that, what would the connection between Toronto and Fukushima be? Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, on a larger scale, but you go to Forest Hill and they're downwind primarily, in terms of our westerly air movement through Toronto. There are accidents that can happen. Uranium can be airborne in terms of the particles of powder that could travel. It can also land on people's organic gardens in the neighborhood, and one neighbor had actually raised that concern. So it can go into the water, and or right into your lungs from the air. But it's as if it doesn't matter, as if it doesn't exist in some way. Now, individual psychology being what it is, we don't know. You'd have to talk to each individual. But collectively, you have this phenomenon of kind of unawareness or obliviousness.
It feels better to be oblivious sometimes.
It could be. I mean, we do what we need to do to feel less bad.
Right. And that's self-medication, yeah. By picking and choosing and cherry-picking what we want to think about. So, it sounds crazy, but there could be an accident or an event or a fire or just equipment falling over, causing dust in the factory to become airborne and stirred up. Or there could be an accident on the rail line, or there could be just any of these unpredictable events that we never are prepared for. But the point is, and even when you argue, contamination amounts will be far below what we think will be a threat to public health, that's not always really the point. It's why would you risk it? Why couldn't you just relocate this plant? There's probably no good reason why you couldn't relocate the plant. I mean, it's really all they're doing is compressing the stuff into pellets, but they have to do it right in the heart of the largest city in our country.
That was absolutely one of the points that was raised by a number of people. And then I would add to that, just because part of my work is with indigenous people, that most likely my guess would be that the plant would be located or relocated on indigenous land or close to it. Not that indigenous people would be employed in it, but that tends to be what happens with toxic, environmentally toxic sites of any sort. For example, near the Amjanong Reserve in what's called Chemical Valley in Sarnia, you look at the uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan and where are they located. I know that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, so-called, one of those euphemistic names, was looking at burying the radioactive waste that is created by reactors back onto indigenous land, as if it followed the traditional teachings of indigenous people, that what you take from the land, you return to the land.
Just as long as it's their land.
Yes, that's right. But in any case, even if you did relocate it to a more desirable site, if such a thing existed, there needs to be no plant, because this is a horrific way of boiling water. To be digging this stuff up from the ground where it belongs, fissioning it, bombarding it with neutrons, and creating 200 or more radionuclides that never existed before in nature. And then what do you do with that? Not to mention all the greenhouse gases that are expended in the mining, the refining, the building of the plants, and then you're left with so-called decommissioning of the plants, which is going to take billions of dollars. These plants are made, steel, concrete are major greenhouse gas emitters in themselves. So the whole industry is just horrific, and there's no reason to have it. And then we haven't touched yet on nuclear weapons, but it's hinted at, and I think there is information on this that's verified, that a particular proportion of the uranium from Canada and of the waste, or at least portions of the radioactive waste created that contains the plutonium, does find its way down into the U.S., where it can be or is incorporated into nuclear weapons. And as we know, I misused the term nuclear renaissance earlier, but it has to do with the fact that nuclear is good now. Nuclear power, it emits nothing in terms of greenhouse gases, but also you have the Obama $1 trillion plan continued by Trump and maybe added to create better nuclear weapons.
I've been asking a bunch of people, in this idea they have to spend over, I think it's $1.5 trillion revamping their nuclear weapons. Will they be reusing old material from nuclear weapons, or are they going to be drumming themselves up nice, fresh plutonium and enriched uranium for those weapons? I mean, this is a boom for new materials. Mm-hmm. I'm just guessing, but because previous actions like trying to create MOX out of recycled materials at least had the justification of reusing some of that material, but we all know that it'll be nice, fresh, new stuff. And whatever materials they have from the weapons that they're going to decommission as a result of spending this new money, that's just going to be more stuff to store and worry about.
Yeah, I think that, there was an initial plan to decommission nuclear weapons, primarily on the part of the U.S. and the legacy of the old Soviet Unions, much of which was residing in Kazakhstan, one of the former Soviet republics. And so that was, not a bad idea. So this potential fuel exists in these weapons, so you might as well use that. There are arguments certainly against that as well. If you explode a nuclear weapon, a lot of your so-called fuel is used up instantaneously. In a nuclear reactor, it's only partially used, and you've created very significant amounts of highly toxic radionuclides, in other words, the radioactive elements that are created by the process of fission. And then they're stored quite often in these so-called nuclear fuel pools, where they have to cool off. The rods from these reactors have to cool off for a number of years before they can even be processed further. And then they can be put in dry casks or whatever storage method, which is woefully inadequate in any case. But the amounts that could be released if you had a power failure and then the water dries up in the pool and then you start to have fires and then releases to the atmosphere, the amounts that can be released from a reactor are vastly greater than the amounts that would be released from a nuclear bomb, whether it's atomic or hydrogen bomb. So that was kind of startling to me when I looked at that reality, but I haven't come across a lot of places where they really have the numbers there. far as I understand, and this isn't my area of expertise, I did, just parenthetically, in my biochemistry PhD and postdoctoral fellowship, a lot of the work that I did was with radionuclides or radioisotopes as a way of tracking various components of processing in the nervous system. So we were studying electric fish primarily to understand at that point how the brain might work. But part of the biochemical work that you do is you work with a lot of radioactive material. So I had to learn how to handle it, learn the biological effects. So, for example, I used an isotope of iodine, and I had to get my thyroid scanned every couple of months by our health department in the I was at the California Institute of Technology. But that's the scary thing, is that essentially a reactor and the waste around it is, you could call it a slow bomb, because it wouldn't be a dramatic explosion, but it would be an enormous amount of highly, highly toxic stuff released into the environment.
The CCNR has a chart of 210 radioactive poisons from 10-year-old CANDU spent fuel. That's quite a fascinating little read when you look through. It's not just some cesium or some iodine or some strontium. There's a long list of their actinides.
Yeah.
And so it's not just one thing.
And that's Gordon Edwards' work, and I recommend everyone go to that site. Go hear him speak.
Well, he's like you. He's famous for having these YouTube videos that are very informative.
It's a few more than mine, but in any case, yeah.
So
go watch him, listen to him.
I have some new trolls. I don't know what sparked this, but there's a scientist on the West Coast who apparently has been studying the concentration of radionuclides, I guess, on the shoreline in BC. And he was even, I think, on TVO. And it was kind of interesting. In the first half of his interview, he seemed to be sort of minimizing the impact of the radionuclides that they're finding on the beaches and in the water on the west coast of just Canada. But then, I don't know, maybe he was asked a question that caused him to go deeper into the actual cause of all this, which is on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, where in the second half of the interview, the news was a little less positive, and he was less able to minimize. So this is what's happening right now. The only people who get grants and funding to do studies are really people who are telling the good news about nuclear contamination.
Well, that's pretty much the way it is. If you think of, in terms of my own field of medicine, you have the pharmaceutical companies that funnel a lot of money into studies. Now, more recently, just because of some scandals that were similar to those of the tobacco companies, you have the requirement, at least in the U.S., to register your study of a drug before you know the results. Because there were studies that showed that there was a publication bias, that it would be the, quote, positive studies in favor of the marketing agenda that would tend to get published significantly more than the negative studies. You had that, you had the tobacco industry, you have that with the fossil fuel industry, and then there's the nuclear industry. I came across a book at the library at U of T, and I want to dig it up again. It was really quite an interesting read. It was how to calm the fears of the public and convince them that the nuclear industry is good. And they had a lot of different examples, and one of them was quite striking. It was actually a South Korean group of young people who were doing role play and essentially training to become public relations people who could calm the fears and convince the public not to worry about nuclear, and it's actually a good thing. And they had a lot of other examples as well, and it pretty much follows a similar script to that of the tobacco and the fossil fuel people and the drug company people. So not only do we have the phenomenon of people in Forest Hill seeming not to be aware of or perturbed by these various risks to their lives and their mansions, but you have an active industry of people whose job it is to confuse and obfuscate. And then on top of that, you have the media that are quite reprehensible in that there's this tendency, you see it in a lot of areas, but or at least I do, that you see one article after another on some topic, like some conflict in the world, and after a while you kind of become numb, because not only are they repetitious, but there are contradictions. And you can have two articles on one page that contradict each other in a newspaper. And it becomes, it's exhausting to encounter that and to try to absorb it. And it may even be, for me, it can be almost involuntary that I just throw up my hands. And, for example, with the situation in Sri Lanka, a number of years ago with the Tamil and the Sinhalese, and just trying to understand that. And then finally you go back to Britain in 1947, where they withdrew from so many of their colonies and mandates, whether it's Palestine, Sri Lanka, Kashmir, India, Pakistan. They left such awful messes in their wake. So you have to look at the history of these things, and then you go to the present and you try to find out who's who and what's what and where do I find my news and all of that. And so just taking that as a kind of off this topic example, although there could be our first
it's very
nuclear war could be India-Pakistan.
Right.
If you have these ultra-nationalist
let me give you an
people
example.
in charge.
Well, it's very okay. So, as a student in Ontario, we're taught history, and a lot of it is Indigenous. And if I talk to somebody maybe a little bit older, educated, maybe in Britain, their view on Indigenous people is very tainted with that British Empire bias.
That they did good.
Yeah, they were saving the savages.
Yeah, brought enlightenment.
Yeah,
the good old British system of.
So the
laws.
point is where you get your news and what era the news is generated in taints and biases the perspective, and unless the reader has a very accurate or a very aggressive ability to do critical thinking. I mean, on one hand, you would say that an unbiased article would try to show both sides of the equation, but all that can do really is to confound the reader often and have them maybe close the story up and say, oh, well, it's best left reasoned by experts.
Well, you're lucky if you do find some attempt to actually explain things and to cover the different sides to it, or different perspectives or points of view. And I think, there's a lot that we have to unlearn from our education in order to begin to learn. And then the other part is looking at, it's interesting, my kids learned critical thinking in elementary school, but they didn't take it to the next step to apply it to current issues. So you can learn, it's like the logical fallacies. You can learn a list, and now what? What you have to apply it. The same with critical thinking skills, which of course overlap. But how do you apply that? And you also have to have educated science reporters, and there are fewer and fewer of those, the science journalists. And then they have to have supportive editors and, in many cases, supported advertisers in their news media to allow them to pursue things.
So I just think back a few years ago, I'm at lunch, I open up the Toronto Star to the business section expecting business news, and it's a double, not a full, a double page ad sprinkled with the Canadian Nuclear Association and every other stakeholder in Canada's nuclear industry. And it's literally, and it says at the top, this page is an advertisement. But it's a reminder that, these media outlets that we don't have very many of, who are actually not all that profitable these days, are desperate for advertising dollars. And the nuclear industry seems to have lots of our money to buy advertising in.
Yeah, they seem to. It's interesting, though, that when you raise the issue of the business pages, because I used to, I have to say this, I would kind of, I went to undergraduate in New York City, and at one of those years, the New York Knicks, the Mets, and the Jets all won their championships. So that was pretty exciting, and I would watch basketball and everything. But since then, I've kind of lost interest. So I take the sports section and the business section, I just sort of put it aside. But then I got very interested in the business section because they have a kind of fiduciary responsibility to investors to spell things out in a fairly accurate way. And so sometimes that's the first section I'll go to see what's going on. Of course, I check all the alternate news sites on the internet. But in terms of the actual paper copy of the newspaper, that's where I'll find things.
So that's the only sort of sign of ethics, really, because, they passed a rule where they have to disclose any interest they may have in covering a business story. There's just a little sliver of ethical journalism there.
If they give you the wrong steer in terms of investments, you can get mad at them,
I wonder if they were pushing uranium as an investment 5 years ago as uranium prices were tanking and tanking and tanking and tanking.
Yeah, you wonder. And that raises the issue of the indemnity, that it's the taxpayer that's the insurer of any nuclear accident.
Well, that's what I wanted to get to about the Lac-Mégantic. That didn't get resolved very fairly in terms of corporate liability.
And can you think of an example where it did?
Well, yeah. In the case of Lac-Mégantic, didn't the major parties just bankrupt within almost no time? And so that would just be normal operating procedure. At that time, the maximum liability for a nuclear operator was still $75,000.
$75,000 or $75 million?
Okay, $75 million.
Okay,
I screwed that
which
up.
is nothing.
It's $75 million. Yeah, you couldn't fix a parking lot for $75 million.
That's right.
So $75 million total liability for a nuclear accident. They upped it to $1 billion, but so that's for nuclear. What about other corporate accidents, industrial accidents? We don't think about liability. We know they'll go bankrupt, and that in the end the taxpayer will foot the bill.
Well, the British Petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I think it was they were fined $15 billion. Which is nothing compared to the devastation of an entire ecosystem. And again, if you looked at the alternative news sites, you would see, in this case, the example, they use this compound called Corexit that would essentially take the oil and make it very dense and then drop it to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico where it lingers still. And then because of the way the ecosystem works, that's going to be brought back up to the surface for how long, who knows. So $15 billion fine, which is really nothing for BP. And then I understand that that's tax deductible in any case. So, of course, corporations pay way less tax when all is said and done than the actual tax rate that is published that applies to them. So I don't know how much of a deduction that actually resulted in.
Interesting. And BP, I think, was very profitable that year. Just for that year, the penalty really didn't amount to being much of a punishment. Yes,
and they're still in business. But I think for smaller companies, you see that they kind of get gobbled up by another company, or they merge, or they change their name or something. So it adds to that general confusion about hazards to our health and existence that I think it's really, really hard to make people aware, to maintain awareness, even to maintain our own attention on a particular issue. For me personally, I'm interested in making linkages, whether it's for people that I work with in my day-to-day work or around various causes. And so I have to pay attention to a lot of different causes, and I have to think in an ongoing way of how might this particular thing. So let's say, the obvious thing is the nuclear power industry and nuclear weapons and militarism in general. How are those linked? And in fact, a lot's been written that links those, makes my job easier. But there are many other areas where the linkage is not obvious at all. It's rarely written about. And so it requires kind of keeping up on a lot of different areas, which is, hard to do. And I'm by no means expert on these areas, but I'm interested in keeping an eye on how they interrelate in some way. But for people going about their busy lives, there may be just one cause. So if you look at the anti-war left, so-called, they're very narrow in their focus. And if you look at ongoing situations like Ukraine, Syria, Israel, Palestine, it's very hard to read the news and to know what's going on at all. And for the left, which tends to be more informed, there's this factionalizing that's going on now. For example, with Syria, you're either pro-Assad and pro-resistance to imperialism on the one side, or you're some kind of fascist, ISIS, Saudi-funded beheading kind of program. And it's neglecting, again, this may be off topic, but we could have a nuclear war triggered by what's going on in Syria now, where you have so many countries, players, some of whom are nuclear powers, that including Israel as well in the Middle East, but that could collide intentionally or inadvertently. But and the idea Syria, is that the Assads had a totalitarian regime that was as bad as most of them that we've read about. So what about that?
The Russians are on one side and the Americans are on the other side of that.
It seems to be, although I'm just not sure about the Americans, because they seem to kind of pop up in different places. If you look at Turkey, if you look at the Kurds, You look at Saudis and the Emirates and the role that they play in various ways, some of which we don't know. Look at Israel's part. And where is the U.S. in all of this? And I think that people are, it's not just with Trump, but pre-Trump. I think that the U.S. Was not a trustworthy ally for a long time. They look out for their own so-called interests, which tend to be, when you trace it back, the corporate interests. So pharmaceuticals, the nuclear industry, so on and so forth.
I thought it was quite interesting that nuclear factored quite highly on the minds of these people who are being accused of colluding with Russia, that it's Russian and American nuclear deals that are really at the center of the money-making that was being pursued by these figures in the Trump controversy.
You're talking about with Syria specifically?
No,
or,
I mean in this Trump controversy that's come up with Russian collusion.
Oh, I got you. Yeah,
his friends were making nuclear deals in Turkey and with even Rosatom. And
I don't know all the detail. That's interesting.
How else would you make money but on these multi-billion-dollar projects? I mean,
so it's a good investment. You may die in the process, but that's a good place to put your money.
Well, it seems the people who build these plants are the ones who make the money. It's everybody else is the one who foots the bill.
Yeah.
Which brings us to back to the plant. So that was a GE Hitachi pellet factory. And it was bought by BWXT Technologies, which is code for Babcock and Wilcox, which has been a boiler maker since 18 whatever, and moved that. So they have a Canadian subsidiary which employs a lot of people in Cambridge. So it's if you just sort of look into the company, they sound like heroes. An American spin-off company that came up here, created jobs, set up shop in Cambridge, and they're boiler makers. Well, that's the central builder in the United States. I've been trying to figure out why GE Hitachi sold that plant and why Babcock and Wilcox is up here buying it.
And what have you found?
No, I'm just asking the questions. I can't find anything. I wondered if it was reminiscent of Westinghouse Toshiba and its bankruptcy in its nuclear division, divesting itself. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting.
They did occur around the same time.
It's just kind of interesting, the big figures, GE, Westinghouse, and their second names, whether it's Toshiba and Hitachi, but divesting themselves. But anyway, I guess BWXT, they have money, again, because they're the builder. And as I'm saying, the only people who seem to make any money are the people who actually just build it. As soon as it's built, it's just a public liability moving forward.
You're talking about the
whole industry of the plants.
The nuclear power plants, which, as people point out often, are a very expensive and dangerous way to boil water. So it's interesting that a boilermaker would have taken that over.
Kind of makes sense.
And there were some hearings. It was a community meeting that Andrew Cash organized when he was the member of parliament for that area. And 200 or 300 people showed up. A number of people spoke. Gordon Edwards, that you brought up before, was patched in on Skype from Montreal. So some very important things were said, and then there was the CNSC hearing.
Yeah, now what was that about? That's 2013, and you intervened.
That's right, I and a number of other people did, and we brought Kristin Skansen down, who is a Cree from northern Saskatchewan, whose land uranium is mined on.
Wow.
She was amazing, and I'm hoping that her YouTube is still up.
I'll look for that.
But she sat down in the hot seat, so to speak, and she had two Indigenous men sitting on either side in their role of support and protection. And it was real theater. The CNSC panelists sat up on a dais, so they were raised up above all of us, looking down on us.
As usual.
And then you would come far away from your supporters in the audience and sit in a way that visually kept you from seeing anyone that might be on your side, so to speak, or be an emotional support, because it's intimidating to go up there.
I know.
And so these two men came, and I think there was an objection raised by Michael Binder or someone on the panel at that time. And then they just insisted, this is our traditional role, we're doing this. And she said that, I don't want to misquote her, but essentially she looked them straight in the eye and said, I am furious that you came on our land without asking for permission. And that was so powerful. And in a sense, when you look at the relative power of various people, the people that can rent out the space and place themselves on high and give themselves a fancy title like Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And just as an aside, their website at the time talked about a safety culture, and they had the slogan, safety is in our DNA. And how ironic is that? Because uranium goes to your DNA and it binds to the phosphate groups along the backbone of your DNA with their alpha particles, which are heavy decay products that can bombard your DNA molecules at close range and alter your DNA. Anyway, so Kristin Skansen reversed the power hierarchy. In a sense, she's saying, you are on our land. You are uninvited guests. And I just found that so powerful, and I think that's where we look to the indigenous movements to lead us, and we settlers, our places behind and in support and in allyship. But what she did in that moment was to reverse the power relation.
And Trudeau recently said, I don't know how serious he was being or whether this will turn into legislation or have any change, but he sort of suggested that Indigenous people should be the stewards of undeveloped Canadian land.
And does that include the Crown land?
Yeah, undeveloped. I think
which would be the 82% of Canada.
I've thought that since I was a kid. That if they're connected to the land, if they're spread out in these areas that aren't looked over or cared for by, and yet they are their traditional hunting grounds and watering holes and so on, it seemed to make sense that would be a pretty noble calling.
And yet,
I'm sure there won't be funding to help them be the stewards.
Exactly. And the funding would be to, in terms of reparation for the theft of the land and the resources, and the pain and suffering and death that generations have experienced as a result of the colonization. Trudeau talks a good talk. Carolyn Bennett, now the Minister of Indigenous Crown Relations, talks a good talk. They know the words to use. But if he means what he says, it's going to be a profound rearrangement of things. And it wouldn't be just the stewards of the unruined land. It would be the stewards of all land, and including Toronto itself.
Because this is Indigenous land.
This is the big
and
smoke.
all these plants. That's why Indigenous peoples go to these hearings, is because these plants are on Indigenous land and drawing water and pumping hot water out and then training fish in their waters. Do you think that these hearings that you went to in 2013 caused any positive effect?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are they just theater?
in some ways they are just theater. We who are concerned about health at all levels, from the molecule to society to the globe, we have to think about the impact on people, and these events either raise awareness to some degree. I don't think it was covered much at all in the media, but it helps us to see each other and to be with each other for sure, and to talk with each other, and to bring our particular ways of understanding and perspectives and experiences together. However, we're swimming upstream against a very powerful current of misinformation, disinformation. The title of your podcast, Too Much Information. How do you make sense of it? What's the framework that you place all this information in your own mind and in relation to others as well? And not just those that you know or meet at these meetings, but people throughout the world. And that's the power of the internet, which we hope this power of the internet can be maintained.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you.
To form these linkages.
Do you think that a grassroots environmental movement is harder to form now than it was 20 years ago?
So thinking historically, going back to Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring, I'm not the best to comment on this. I'm not a social scientist, but just my impression is I think it's harder to organize, with some exceptions. So there was a demonstration against genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, a few years ago downtown, and it was a huge gathering, and I was looking around, and I usually see the usual people, we call them the usual suspects, at these demonstrations, and there were only a couple of other people that I recognized out of I think several thousand. So there are people that care about what they put in their bodies. And then the question is how to make the link to that just because you don't use pesticides or fertilizers in an area of land that you're growing crops doesn't protect you from fallout from Fukushima or lead pollution from factories or mercury from the coal-fired power plants or whatever else is spewed out by the nearby freeway and the traffic on it, and so on and so forth, that is going to be there in that supposedly organic food that you eat. So I think there's a linkage there to make, but it has to be made. And that's where people need to be educated. They need to be first brought through a process of unlearning in whatever way that they can bring themselves, and then to begin to look at all of these linkages. And I guess if somebody starts to feel overwhelmed or exhausted by it, then they need to do whatever they need to do. But having a framework to put it into. So, for example, for me, I'm excited by learning and by seeing new things and seeing new connections. So it gives me energy to do that, and I need to do that. I want to do that. Not everybody is necessarily going to experience it in the same way that I do, but I think that there is that experience of really getting something and knowing something that I think most people feel very good about.
Find us on Twitter at @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
It is sort of telling that in our information age, where we have most of the history of human experience as knowledge on our cell phones, if your answer, it's harder to start an environmentalist grassroots movement now than it was 20 years ago, information wasn't the problem. And, the effect of it all has been to fracture us. That even when we go back 40 years into a time when there were only 3 or 4 sources of news, bad as that sources may have been, at least the facts were limited to within a scope. Now today, news and information is so fractured, and it's from so many different opposing sources, that it is too much information.
And it's the name of your podcast speaks to a quantity, and I think what you're also saying is how disarticulated or disjointed it has become. And it brings me back to this book that I'd mentioned about the how to convince people that the nuclear industry is good for you. Because when I talk about swimming upstream against the current, I think the current has become stronger. The access of information is greater than previously, because I used to have to go to a library and search around on the stacks to find something. Now I can type in the search terms and up it comes, below the ads, of course, on Google. But it's becoming harder to kind of undo the confusion that the so to speak PR people have learned to do.
Isn't that ironic? That with more information, we're more confused.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting? That is fascinating.
And again, there are exceptions. There are exceptional people out there. There are exceptional websites who are very incisive and thoughtful, and they think about the people who are affected. Whatever way of thinking, their framework, it's who is suffering, who's profiting here, who is suffering, and in what way, and why historically, why in terms of current events, current processes, political processes, economic processes. An interesting thing is I was at a book launch a week and a half ago. It was on pension plans and how they're invested, and 90% plus or minus of the Canada pension plan is invested overseas. A pretty big percentage is invested in industries that are killing us or can kill us. Do we know that as a people? Well, and if we knew that, then what? Then what do we do? Each of us individually. Is there the potential for a collective that can form around this? And it takes time, it takes effort, it takes work, and a lot of these things are really hard to look at because, the Santa Claus thing that many of us might have been brought up with, and then you find out there is no Santa Claus. That's hard, but we can be helped. And if you look at children, and I do work with children who who quite often can see at a certain age, they can see what's going on. Like you mentioned that when you were 10 or so, you became aware of and interested in something, and maybe you weren't hearing it at home or wherever or at school, but you noticed something, you picked up on it, you pursued it, you educated yourself. And so I think we adults sometimes have to maybe remember how it was in childhood when we were filled with curiosity and we could question things and we could notice things.
Maybe it's us who are overwhelmed by too much information. Maybe these young people who have grown up with all this internet and cell phones. And I'm sort of thinking of the anti-NRA protests that the young people did a couple weekends ago. Most of us are all surprised by that.
Yeah, I'm kind of I'm struck sometimes by young people that I talk to or work with, that they know more than I think they know. You know, when we get into conversation about certain things, I listen to a lot of the speeches at various rallies of the students. And they're very powerful and, incredible, like an 11-year-old black girl and 9-year-old granddaughter of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I saw that.
What I didn't hear so much as in the excerpts that I listened to was that they talk about there is no place for assault rifles in schools or anywhere else in the U.S. I didn't hear about there's no place for assault rifles anywhere in the world.
Right.
And who are the big arms exporters?
Yeah.
And then we can look at Canada's role in that and sending all these military vehicles to Saudi Arabia that is causing one of the greatest human catastrophes in Yemen. Not to mention whatever role they have or have had in terms of these horrific things that we see in the Middle East.
So if it creates jobs, we'll do it, no matter how unethical.
And this brings up, it reminds me of the one of the hearings about the GE Hitachi nuclear pellet plant, the uranium pellet plant. They had a couple of workers at the plant, and they were good union jobs, good relationship with the employers, absolute confidence in their safety. Why? Because they had been told it was safe. And when I reached out to my city councilor, Joe Mihevich, who arranged for a meeting with me and himself. He was the board chair of the Toronto Board of Health, and then people from the Toronto Public Health, and there was no one actually from GE Hitachi at that point. But we look at what are the safety standards, where do they come from, and when you start to look at that, you discover how our safety standards constructed. And then that leads you to looking at how is safety determined anyway? Who are these oversight agencies? Who serves on those oversight agencies? And certainly with Trump, you see that all the chicken houses are now being overseen by foxes. So that's kind of an extreme example, but that idea of what's called regulatory capture is occurring. But getting back to these workers in the plant, they have good union jobs. So there are so many things that need to be done, like just if you look at infrastructure, if you look at retrofitting buildings, these glass condo towers that are going up where the windows are going to come loose in 10 or 15 years and start falling on people because they're so cheaply constructed, where, whoever thought of having glass walls in this northern climate? It's crazy. So what I said is that there are plenty of good jobs out there that need to be done, for example, in infrastructure. The other part is that the war against unions that are going on everywhere. Good union jobs are getting scarcer and scarcer.
It seems to me that the union should be the activist here. Shouldn't they be the front line protecting the workers? And they, I guess, I'm just going to guess, that they know that if they increased worker safety, that would increase the costs of labor, which would hurt the business and reduce union jobs. So they've balanced going along with the owner at the expense of the safety and health of the worker.
I think that's a good point. I'm not, again, that's not an area of my expertise. I have had conversations with people, including in unions, who are basically acknowledging that. And there are some good unions and some excellent union members who I think see these connections. But they also see the writing on the wall is that union membership is declining. It's getting harder and harder to certify a union, to gain union membership, particularly if you look south of the border to the so-called right to work legislation and how that is impacting very significantly on union membership, on the funding for unions, the strike funds, the ability to have some political influence to counteract the massive influence of the corporate sector that we all know about. It's getting very concerning. But absolutely, this should be, and it has been historically, one of the main activities of unions is to protect their workers.
What were your specific objections to what was going on at the Hitachi plant?
It was in a sense, the usual smoke and mirrors, where you have panelists, including one who was a medical doctor from Alberta, essentially just shrugging their shoulders and saying it's safe.
And there were stories
it's safe because I say so.
Stories of like the doors opening now and then and drafts coming through the building, airborne dusts. Was there not the idea that in regular maintenance, some of these uranium particles could have been run down the sewer lines?
Oh, you're asking about the plant?
Yeah.
I was thinking of the hearing that I intervened at. Right. In terms of the plants, it was what escapes via the airborne route, including through the so-called stack.
And these pellets are heated up when they're compressed, so you can just imagine vapors and
high temperature processes. You've got the sacks of. It was interesting when I asked one of the public health people, in what form is the yellow cake brought into Toronto, and she said, I think it's in sacks.
Wow.
So rather than at least metallic barriers. And again, I think, I don't know if I've made this point as yet, but what the nuclear industry likes to do, and does so repeatedly, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, our guardians of health, that they confuse you about internal and external radiation. So uranium emits alpha particles which don't travel very far. And so as long as they're outside the body, yes, they are relatively harmless because the radiation they emit is insufficient to make it into the body directly. Unlike, people are familiar with X-rays that go right through the body, or gamma rays. So what they'll talk about is that having a sack of uranium next to you is going to be comparable in some way
to bananas,
to bananas.
What's the banana equivalent?
Or to traveling, flying from Toronto to Vancouver. It's when it gets in the body that it matters.
And none of the risk modeling, or very little of it, ever talks about ingestion. It's always whole body exposure from a certain distance to a 35-year-old military grade,
right,
full-grown man.
And it's all averaged out. In your interview with Chris Busby, I highly recommend to any listener to this podcast. He so clearly explains all of this.
Something that's occurred to me is that for very little price comparatively, and especially if greenwashing the nuclear industry is so important, wouldn't there be an epidemiological study at every single nuclear plant proving for sure how safe and wonderful it is? I mean, because there isn't even one, basically. But after 60 or 80 years, shouldn't there be a couple? But if it's so safe, and I don't think these studies probably would cost all that much money in the relative scheme of things compared to a multi-billion-dollar plant, there should be an epidemiological study at every plant, proving without a shadow of a doubt how crazy people like me or you are.
Well, I think that we're beginning to see those studies being done, and you're familiar with Libby Halevi's podcast, Nuclear Hot Seat.
Mm-hmm.
Her most recent one is with someone named Mangano, mm-hmm. and he talks about 3 Mile Island, of course. It was on the anniversary.
I was trying to get him on my show.
And then there's a couple of nuclear plants in New Jersey where they now have access to the data that is collected anyway. It's county by county data on death rate and cancer rates. And so by crunching those numbers and then looking at each year and then looking at when did the nuclear plant start running in that particular county, and some of them are more populated, some are less populated, some are quite rural, some have very little industry to begin with. So the background level of toxicity of all sorts is low, so you have low cancer rates. So your so-called signal-to-noise ratio is such that you begin to look at, for example, in one of the counties in New Jersey, where there's an excess of 2,500 cancer deaths post-nuclear plant as opposed to pre-nuclear plant for a comparable period of time. Now you're beginning to see this kind of thing. You're beginning to see the outcome from Chernobyl. And I remember I had a patient actually who had survived Chernobyl, had come over here from Ukraine, and had been through all the horrendous leukemia treatment, and it had affected his ability to think because of the radiation to the brain that's part of the treatment to rid him of leukemia cells, and then all the emotional aspects of having to be dislocated and everything else, and living with relatives. But it was really awful to see, and I can't say I've seen a lot of patients where I could identify the link between, and I've worked at Sick Kids for many years with children with brain tumors and other nervous system disorders, but I can't claim that there's a direct link between that child's illness and a particular nuclear accident or power plant. But it's awful to see that, and Helen Caldecott speaks of that so eloquently. All the leukemia cases, the children, and caring with them into their deaths, and being there to support the parents and other family members. It's really terrible. So getting from the human factor back to the epidemiology, which is looking at so many people and trying to look using statistics as, how many of these horrendous cases these awful human experiences can be related to each of these plants. Well, people are doing them now, and because cancers can take decades to appear, it's only now that you can begin to see the significant statistical changes at a population level. And you may see a few to several percentage changes, but then when you calculate that based on the population, that's an enormous number of cancers. Mm-hmm. That's a horrendous amount of pain and suffering, aside from the expense to society.
When did you get interested in activism?
Activism,
and maybe,
in general,
people often they want to pick the word activism, advocacy. When did you get involved in doing more than just what it takes for you to make a living?
Well, I'm reminded of a young woman indigenous activist from Chemical Valley near Sarnia, where you have all the petrochemical plants. Who, when asked that same question about becoming an activist, she said, I'm not an activist, I'm a community member. Mm-hmm. And so when did I become a community member? It's maybe a bit of an interesting story, but I grew up in a family where there was some degree of awareness of all the contradictions in society. It wasn't particularly left-wing or socialist or anything like that, but just an awareness of the complexity. I have two family members who were physicists, and I myself ended up majoring in physics for a couple of years, and then math, and then I went into biology and biochemistry, and then ultimately into medicine. But I'd say at age 12, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was, old enough to understand something. I also, just because of where we lived, and it was an odd set of circumstances, but I ended up going to a Quaker school for several years, beginning in grade 2. And the Quakers, otherwise known as the Friends, were a kind of a sect that refused to worship the King of England, and they wore very plain clothes on Sunday, and they didn't believe in preachers or priests, and so everyone was their own church, if you will, and you would have what was called the inner light. And I'm not religious, but it was growing up with that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Where, whatever occurs to you, we would sit once a week in this big room, 250 plus people, from 6-year-olds up to 90-year-olds, in silence until someone had something they wanted to say, and they would stand up and speak. Wow. And everybody would listen very respectfully. So coming from that, and then during the Vietnam War, they were sending medical supplies to North Vietnam, and this is in the U.S. where I come from originally. And then having my own children, I used to sort of say half jokingly that when I retire, I'm going to chain myself to a nuclear reactor, because I knew enough about the whole nuclear weapons, nuclear industry. And I was also draft age during the Vietnam War. I had a plan to come to Canada just in case, but in my year of not having any kind of student deferment, they had a lottery based on our birthdays. My number was just sufficient so that they didn't get to my number that year, and then I was no longer subject to the draft. But I thought, there's no way I'm going to let them send me to shoot at somebody that I have no problem with. Mm-hmm. I also was privileged enough to have enough information to know that my government was lying about the Vietnam War and the whole pretext. But I didn't know all the facts, and I'm still learning. And it sort of went from there. And then when I was in university, I was involved in a student strike and building occupations. And initially the cause was around civil rights. And then our Black Student Caucus said, thanks very much. This is our cause. You choose your own. So we said, okay, well, there's war. So we went and supported both causes. And then we could see the linkage between the two, that having an oppressed, racialized population who were being sent overseas to kill people that they had no problem with, to defend a country that was oppressing them in their own country, and seeing all these linkages happening, it was a very heady kind of time that then hit upon the 70s, and what we later learned were FBI programs to suppress dissent very effectively, I think. There were professors who were targeted and fired, and then you had the reticence or self-inhibition in the academy of faculty, including tenured faculty. So you had a kind of falling apart, I think, of a movement in terms of the teaching, the education, the media. The New York Times used to publish some pretty good stuff back in those days. Not consistently so, but you could find it there.
I notice on your front lawn there's a Stop
Line 9.
Stop Line 9 sign on your front lawn. So you're not just interested in nuclear, you're interested in a wide spectrum of issues. It's not just any one thing.
Absolutely. Like I was saying, that it's linking all these different causes. So if we want to go, how do you link Line 9, which is one of the Enbridge lines that is, I believe it's over 40 years old. We know actually from the news media about multiple leakages and spills from Enbridge and other pipelines. We followed the Dakota Access Pipeline and learned that as soon as it was started up, there were already leaks and spills. But you have the tar sands, the Alberta tar sands, producing through this horrendously polluting process involving destruction of boreal forest forevermore, to produce this tar that is then processed into diluted bitumen, it's called, that can then be piped through pipelines and transported over long distances. And then the idea was to reverse the Line 9 that was coming from the east to Sarnia for further processing in their petrochemical and refinery plants. It was going to be reversed to carry that diluted bitumen in the other direction towards the east. And inevitably there would be spills. And then guess what? It's going through the northern part of Toronto. It's going underneath a subway station. It's going near schools and playgrounds, and so on and so forth. So now, where is some of that tar sands oil destined for? Well, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and other agreements, there is a requirement that Canada, no matter what, supply a certain amount of oil to the U.S. for military usage. The U.S. military is the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, not to mention the nuclear arsenal that's on hair trigger alert, already targeted to various targets, many of which make no sense at all anymore, if they ever did in the past. So we have the military use of the oil that comes from the tar sands that would also be shunted through Toronto. And then wherever it goes to, it would be burned and go into the massive amounts of carbon dioxide that can last hundreds of years in the atmosphere, retaining the heat. The sun's energy is great. It's converted to heat energy that is then trapped by the CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then that adds more and more energy to the Earth's system, the climate system, and then we get chaotic weather patterns. I look at the jet stream every day, and it's got these wild up and down curves, bringing us the cold weather we're experiencing right now. But at another time, it'll bring us the hot weather, and when it brings us the cold weather, it brings somebody else the hot weather.
Yeah.
So we can't judge by what's happening right around us. And so that's where you get the linkages, and that's why the sign on our lawn, stop line 9, and it specifically refers to the oil spills that inevitably will result, and that is awfully hard to clean up. And oil, you think of it just as a thick goo, and you just sort of take out your paper towel and you wipe it up and it's done with, but you're breathing fumes from it as well. And it's also toxic when it gets on your skin, and it'll get in your food as well and in your water. And that's where if you have an oil spill, and we have certain water courses that travel, and one of the people who puts things on YouTube did a YouTube of where that pipe, the Line 9, crosses the Don River. And it's just right there, and it's exposed. And if and when that leaks, it goes into the Don River, or it could go into the Humber River, and then it travels down to Lake Ontario, which is where we get our water. And I doubt that our water filtration and purification infrastructure is capable of handling that.
Are you disheartened by the fact that you've got the sign on your front lawn and it didn't spread to other front lawns? I mean, that's part of being an activist or a community member, is battling, it's hopeless, versus, doing something. And I mean, I've used this phrase a few times, a swing back between you deserve a world that makes sense to you can't fight City Hall. And, you put all this effort out into these good causes, and they don't always catch on. And how do you keep fighting forward and not becoming discouraged?
I guess it would be, for all of us, I think it's going to involve having difficult conversations with people who, for their various personal, individual reasons, may respond or react in certain ways. This is a great thing that you're doing. It's getting out to people. You and I are having a conversation, and we're both clearly interested in what we're talking about, and concerned, very, very concerned. And that's really great. I don't do enough of it. I think most of us don't do enough of it. You're doing a great service by having this. I don't get the word out there very much myself. I'm not doing enough to do that. I don't want to lecture people. When I'm most effective, it's engaging somewhere, something of mutual concern. I have to be thoughtful in how I talk about it. I have to be aware of the other person. I'm not always so great at that, especially in the moment. So I have to kind of think about that and work on that as well.
Are you an optimist?
So I anticipated that question. Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Often asks, what gives you hope? And I can't say that I'm hopeful or optimistic. I think of two things. One is that so many people in the world are getting so deeply affected every day by what we're doing here in Canada in terms of selling arms, intervening where we have no business intervening,
exporting uranium,
producing tar sands oil, emitting greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth.
We've got a leaf on our flag, which I think is false advertising.
Yes, but it's a dying leaf, right? It's
been cut off from the tree too.
It's a leaf in the fall. But the vast majority of people in the world go through every day as they must. They go through for their children, their families, their communities. You know, the women that walk kilometers every day to bring the water back at great personal risk. And that's where we could intervene in a very helpful way. Or first, don't get in their way when we're in their way, and then we can. There are some things that can help. You know, it's hard for them, some of the communities, to build their own water pump. The water tables are lowering as we speak, so we're contributing to that indirectly through climate change. But there are people that just go day by day. The other part is the other answer is the quote from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian who was concerned, I think, to his dying days, spent quite a lot of time in prison, thinking about how people could form some kind of community or collective. But he talked about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. So in terms of the will, I can't sit back and say, okay, well, I've done this and that, and I don't see any other lawn signs, so forget it, I'll just do what I want to do. Because I always think about people that I work with in my day-to-day work, people that I encounter at all kinds of meetings and discussions, and people that I'm aware of all throughout the world who they don't have the luxury of saying, well, you know, we don't have any water, so why get water? Why get up in the morning and get water or food?
Doug Ford. So is that populism moving north? I mean, we almost got it with is it Kevin O'Leary? I always screwed the guy's name up. The guy from Shark Tank, or the neoconservative. I thought that we dodged a bullet with that. In fact, in my fantasy, I was like, we almost went there. Mm-hmm. Then people thought, oh, it's Trumpism, and then they nixed that, and I thought the next leader of the Conservative Party might be someone other than Doug Ford. But so Doug Ford, who said he would have voted for Trump just yesterday, I think he said.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
How afraid of Doug Ford are you?
I remember the Mike Harris years back in the 90s.
The common sense revolution?
And yes, the so-called common sense. And I'm also reminded more recently of Rob Ford as mayor of Toronto. And this question of why do people vote against their interests? It gets to this question of misinformation, and that people are not being treated well in this so-called neoliberal political economic revolution, where it's every person for themselves. What's interesting about the Ford brothers is that they seem paradoxically to have gathered a community together, including with more visible diversity than you'll likely find at most political gatherings in Canada. So it's a real seeming contradiction. But what I understand of Trump as well is that this billionaire real estate reality TV show guy, got a lot of people to support him that are having their lives ruined by the kinds of people who support him at the higher level, are in his government, and whom he's supporting.
Pruitt is just every day. That's just a slow motion disaster unfolding. But what you said about them voting for people who don't represent their interests, that's just... and that is that a global movement? It's where, America and Canada, that's not the only place where this movement of populism is afoot.
Yeah, there's a psychology is not something to be messed with. And yet it is.
Are we getting dumber the more information we have?
Again, it's it gets back to is it the quantity or the quality, or the quality with which it's put forth, and what's put in and what's left out. I think there's certainly an attraction to someone that promises a quick solution, or who presents themselves as, I care about you, I understand you, your interests are being harmed by these people. And so Trump had a good case in terms of the free trade agreements. He even talked like an anti-war candidate at times, saying Iraq was a mistake. Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate, aside from her being a woman, which is no guarantee of anything if you look at Golda Meir or Indira Gandhi or Margaret Thatcher. But that being aside, she represented militarism,
the status quo,
the American hegemony, overthrow of governments.
She laughed when they killed bin Laden.
That was Gaddafi, maybe bin Laden as well. I remember the photo of her hand over her mouth when they were supposedly watching the killing of bin Laden.
Let me ask you this. If you had a choice, Trump or Hillary for president right now? It shouldn't be that hard.
Please don't make me... So taking it as a very narrow question of the two evils and which would be lesser, I guess my concern about Trump is he can push the button. And with Hillary, I think she would be able to stop herself from pushing the button. I just want to make one comment about Trump, that as we become excited on a daily basis by his tweets, what's happening more or less behind the scenes is that he is appointing a vast number of judges at all levels that he can appoint in the U.S. who will be there for decades. Not to mention the Supreme Court, but at the lower levels. And these are often where appeals are taken in terms of environmental issues or environmental crimes. And so that's a pretty big story that's not getting talked about very much. I don't think Hillary Clinton would have appointed such horrible judges at those levels. I think she was a contradiction in character, because I think there were some very good things that she really did sincerely support and care about. I think that at the global strategic level, she was quite flawed.
Is there a permanent effect? Is there permanent damage being levied against democracy itself when every single word out of the leader can't be believed and or is backpedaled or contradicted within hours? I mean, in terms of, I'm often interested by this. Somebody once said that prohibition in the early part of the last century had an effect to ruin people's trust in governments. So if every cop was on the take and priests were getting licenses to distribute wine and people were getting medical licenses for alcohol and everybody was against it, and speakeasies were all about, it was clear that the government had made the wrong decision and was enforcing it in a bad way. And some people suggest that for decades after that, that actually created a distrust in government itself. I have a feeling that the same can be said of this destruction of the respectability and honor and parliamentary rule and the sort of, at least the preponderance of impropriety that used to decide whether or not you would resign or stay in office. Or does it have a permanent effect on maybe their ability to govern us moving forward?
I think of, I'm originally from the States, and so I was better educated in how that governmental system works and the idea of checks and balances, which I think have pretty much disappeared, at least currently. In Canada, it's Parliament and Privy Council, I understand. With Harper, he began to use language that essentially you heard in the U.S. around the central executive. So the Prime Minister's office became the executive of Canada and began to operate somewhat in that way. And maybe it was just too much American TV that people were watching. But getting back to, I think what your question is about is when you have someone like Trump, or you have a Trudeau who spoke so eloquently and beautifully, but now it's getting to be a bit of a broken record, and you're seeing what has he actually followed through on. I think it's good for democracy, not for democratic institutions per se, but for democracy, because ultimately democracy is not showing up and voting every 4 years or so. It's about talking to each other. It's about neighborhood councils. It's about going to city council hearings and speaking, which can be an endurance affair if you go and, they go till midnight and whatever, and you've got to go to work and the next day. But there's a lot of ways that one can have democracy operating. But I think what you're getting at is that the people in various offices are showing themselves to be the hypocrites that they've always been, the corrupt people that many of them have always been, and they're potentially marginalizing themselves. Again, with the caveat that they can start a war. They can blow up the world in terms of the U.S.
Do you think that the buffoonery has caused us now to be more involved and more likely to talk about it at the dinner table and bring politics more into the discussion?
Perhaps, from my own personal experience, there are two kinds of dinner table conversations. One is, it was like with George W. Bush, what an idiot. But let's not talk about what he's doing in the world to people all around the world. It's just, and to our future as life on Earth. But what an idiot. Look at how he mangles his sentences. That's not a productive conversation. Mm-hmm. But if you can say, well, this person, we pulled back the curtain and there's Oz and he's just this guy with a bunch of levers and noisemakers, then we can begin to rise up out of our complacency and say, and this is a quotation from the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, that they used to have on the U of T email when you would open it up every day. It's somebody's got to do something, and it's incredibly pathetic that it has to be us. So that's the positive outcome.
Dr. Jim Deutsch received his A.B. in analytical biology at Columbia, a Ph.D. in biochemistry at Caltech, and an M.D. at Yale. He is on the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and at the Toronto Psychoanalytic Institute. Dr. Jim Deutsch spoke to us from his home in Toronto. Find us on Twitter, @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer.
And I'm Dr. Jim Deutsch from Midtown Toronto.